Meanwhile, I'd like to delve into and introduce our panelists. So, from United States, we have Lawrence Reed, President Emeritus of the Foundation for Economic Education and Humphreys Family Senior Fellow, a lifelong champion of liberty, free market, and individual character, and the author of the forthcoming Born of Ideas: How Principle, Faith, and Courage Forged America. And from India, Guru Charan Das, a celebrated author and public intellectual, former CEO of Procter and Gamble India, and a leading voice of liberalism, market, and ethics. He is the author of India Unbound, The Difficulty of Being Good, and most recently, The Dilemma of the Indian Liberal. And steering this conversation is our moderator, Gangam Gangraju, an acclaimed national award winning producer, screenwriter, and director in the Telugu film industry, the creator of the iconic sitcom Amrutham, and the author of the book Vihangam. A storyteller who has spent his life moving ideas through culture, the perfect guide for tonight. Gangraju Garu, the floor is yours.
I don't know how I stumbled into this August gathering, but yeah, I'm designated a moderator, but I'm here to listen. Listen and learn from these two distinguished gentlemen. Distinguished is a longish word that falls woefully short of encapsulating what these two speakers have accomplished. For decades, they have spoken and written with great conviction and clarity about the necessity of personal freedom for human flourishing. So, Mr. Lawrence Reed, you go first.
All righty. Thank you, Gunnar. Special thanks to my fellow panelists and the moderator, and also to Ravi and his team, all those who participated in putting this program together and making it possible. Also to the Swatantrata Center and to the group that I represent today, and you'll have other panelists from it as well. That is the Free Society Coalition. And I encourage you all to take a look at our website, freesocietycoalition.org. There you'll see our brochure, which talks about the ideas behind the Declaration of Independence. I will touch on some of those in my remarks in a moment. When I left graduate school many years ago, 1970s, I first began my public career as a professor, and I taught for 7 years. And the incoming freshmen, I wanted to impress upon a lot of things, but very early, I think typically the very first class, I would ask a series of questions, hoping that each one would prompt them to get a little closer to the answer I was looking for. I would ask them a very general starting question, such as, what makes the world go round? You know, that could mean almost anything. But then the questions would get more specific, such as, what decides whether people embrace this kind of economic system or political system or another kind of political or economic system? What determines the course of history? What brings about changes in history, especially the big ones? And typically the initial answers to that series of questions would be names of people or particular institutions. The students would say, oh, it's the church that decides those things, or it's the news media, or it's the government, it's the politicians. Sometimes they would say the people, which is, I guess, everybody. But I was looking for something, I think, far more important in some senses. The one-word answer I was hoping to get, and sometimes I would get it sooner or later, but I was looking for the word ideas. Ideas. As Victor Hugo, the great French author, once said, ideas are more powerful than all the armies of the world. Nothing is as powerful as an idea whose time has come. I can't think of a better phrase to summarize what happened in 1776 than to quote Victor Hugo, when he said in that second quote, "Nothing is as powerful as an idea whose time has come." Ideas shape the way we think, and then that in turn determines how we act in every sphere of life, how we treat other people, the kinds of systems we will support, who we will vote for, whether we will change from one way of thinking or one political and economic system to another. It's what goes on up here that is of critical importance in explaining what happens out there. So when we talk about the American Revolution, you cannot avoid a discussion of ideas, because it was motivated by ideas. It may not have been the first revolution in history motivated by lofty ideas, but it certainly is one of the most important in history, if not the very first, to be influenced overwhelmingly by ideas. In other words, and good ideas, not ideas of personal power or ideas of taking charge so you can push other people around, controlling the government and using it to control other people. I'm talking about ideas that are worth studying because they are so lofty, so noble, and why that is the case I will get into in a moment. Americans are still asking the question, well, when should we say America began? And many would say, oh, well, that's 1776, the Declaration of Independence. That's when we began. Well, in one sense, yes, that's when we started to be an independent nation and declared it so. But there were many things, ideas, events, people, and so forth that came before that will inform the founders of the year 1776. I like to tell audiences that I think America began in 1620. Now, what happened in 1620? You might say, well, that wasn't the first time that settlers came from Europe to settle America. It wasn't even the first time that English settlers came. The first permanent English settlement was Jamestown, and that was begun in 1607. But even it did not produce the kind of incredible document I want to quickly tell you about called the Mayflower Compact. This is in 1620. This is the first time that an agreement was arrived at about governance, about government between two groups of people, neither of which were in the government. All previous agreements were between some group of people and the monarch or the parliament or whoever was in charge of the government. But on the Mayflower, the vessel that brought a little over 100 people from England and Holland to America, you had two groups of people. You had the Pilgrims. Everybody knows who they were. They were fleeing religious persecution in England. But then you had a roughly equal number of people that the Pilgrims called the strangers, whom they didn't really know until the boat left to come to America. The strangers were put on the boat by the investors in this experiment because they thought the Pilgrims would need them given their various skills and craftsmanship in starting the colony. But they weren't on the ship for the same reason as the Pilgrims. So that set the group up for potential conflicts, or at least, they didn't know each other well, but they got to know each other somewhat on the voyage. It turned out that because of the winds, the ship was blown way far north from where it was supposed to land. It was supposed to land in what is present-day Virginia, but instead it arrived hundreds of miles north off of Cape Cod, which is part of Massachusetts. And when everybody on the ship discovered that, there is a great deal of disagreement. The strangers begin to tell the Pilgrims, hey, we're way off course. That voids our agreement. We may not stay with you. We may go off on our own or take the first boat back. But this voids all prior agreements. And so there was potential for the colony right from the start to split in half. And then within sight of land, before they actually landed, the Pilgrims and the strangers wrote an agreement, the first in the history of mankind between two people, not involving the government. Even the Magna Carta in Great Britain was a group of nobles and the monarch. It was an agreement between them. But this was two groups of people on a ship in which they said, when we land, we are going to create a government of mutual consent. Everyone will be can be an equal participant in it. There'll be no restrictions on who can hold office. You can run. You can win the votes necessary among your compatriots to hold public office. It's going to be a government of mutual consent because we're going to respect one another and our individual rights. Well, that's remarkable. And that Mayflower Compact really set the tone for so much of what was to follow. Our founders in 1776 remembered that agreement, and they said, we're basically doing the same today, but on a much bigger scale than they did in 1620. This was a revolution of ideas. Subsequent to the Mayflower Compact, and for many decades before 1776, you had an intellectual ferment in the colonies that eventually would take it well ahead of England in terms of people's notions of individual rights and what the role of government should be. Way ahead of England, which was the freest country in Europe in the 1770s, but still had a long ways to go. We, in the end, proved to be a lot further ahead of them. If I had to identify the groups of ideas, and there are two big ones that influenced the founders, in which they were percolating for all these decades, and then wrote the Declaration. I would say the first one was known as the Enlightenment. It did come from Europe, but I think we took it further. We were the first country on the planet to actually be founded on the ideals of the Enlightenment. The rest of Europe was just talking about them. And the Enlightenment did a number of things. It emphasized the use of your brain and the gift, some would say, as I would, that the gift of reason is part of what our Creator made of us when He designed us. The Enlightenment said, hey, we should look at things like evidence and just not take what the king says or the government says as gospel, but rather let's look at empirical evidence. Let's use what became known as the scientific method, rationality. The Enlightenment promoted the right to question authority. And you have to understand how incredibly new this was. Yeah, Magna Carta did it in 1215, but that was a small group of people. But on a broad scale, the Enlightenment said everybody has a right to question authority. And when the king says, I rule by divine right, we don't have to take that as gospel, make him prove it. So Enlightenment philosophers, some more radical than others, began to promote the notions of individual liberty, religious tolerance, the idea of progress. We can make a better world if we work at it. Natural rights that come with you at your birth as part of your nature. They began promoting ideas of constitutional government. Instead of all power to the king, let's have a written document that says you can do this and you can go no further than that, and so forth. Separation of church and state, that idea begins percolating in this period. The American Revolution served as the first successful real-world test of Enlightenment ideals. But you had another set of ideas that begins in the 1730s. The Enlightenment starts in the late 17th century, goes for about 100 years. But the Great Awakening begins a little later, late 1730s and into the 1740s. This was a Christian revival in which preachers and pastors sought to ignite the passions of Christian believers. But it wasn't entirely religious. They also picked up where the Enlightenment had left off or had started, and were preaching that each individual is unique and precious. That's the way he or she was made by God. That means they have to have choices to be themselves. So that suggests freedom. You had by 1776 a great many pastors all over the colonies, especially in New England, giving sermons regularly that talked about the natural rights of life, liberty, and property. So the Enlightenment ideas and the Great Awakening ideas, very much on the minds of America's founders in 1776. Since 1760, for the next 16 years, they have a new king in Britain, and he starts cracking the whip. And that puts the colonies on a collision course with the mother country, because in the colonies, we're thinking increasingly about the importance of the individual and the importance of government being transparent and responsible, accountable, and representative. And yet here's this mother country trying to tax us without representation. We don't have any members of parliament. They thought that was a violation of individual rights and English rights in particular. Well, Benjamin Franklin, in a meeting in London with Admiral Thomas Howe, right on the eve of the Revolution, put it so well when he warns the Admiral against underestimating American patriots. He's telling him, hey, we're a different people than we were 100 years ago. We have been informed by ideas of liberty and independence and individuality and private property and limited, accountable government. And he says to the Admiral, now that they, meaning American patriots, now that they have dealt with the tyrant within themselves, Great Awakening, now that they have dealt with the tyrant within themselves, they have mustered the courage to confront the one across the sea. What a warning. Well, I may be about out of time. Let me just touch on the preamble of the Declaration, because that's where these ideas really come into play in language that is nothing less than immortal, that we'll be quoting hundreds of years from now. Who can forget this opening line? We hold these truths to be self-evident. That's powerful. It doesn't say we kind of think these truths are okay. We're not sure. We'll decide for sure maybe later, but there's room for debate. They're saying we hold these truths to be self-evident. They are beyond dispute. We're done talking about whether or not men are created equal. We're going to declare it and declare that it's self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed with by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Nobody in the history of the world had ever expressed it in such eloquent language as Thomas Jefferson and his editors expressed in that opening statement, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that when any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government. In other words, government should be a servant of the people. It should not simply dominate them because it thinks it knows best. That's a revolutionary idea in 1776. Government has to prove to the people that it's responsible and accountable to them, that it's listening to them, that it's carrying out their wishes. And if it does not, it has no automatic right to continue to exist. The people then have the right to get rid of it and put in its place a government that will get the job done and respect their rights. That's truly revolutionary. And as an American, I'm so proud that we did that 250 years ago. Thank you so much. And I'm happy to turn it back over to who gets it next. Anushka?